My name is Haley O'Toole. I am the Historical and Cultural Interpretation Supervisor at the Garden, which means a lot of my time is spent curating the collection of Tower Grove House and caring for the interpretation that we share about the history of the garden. And this manifests itself in many different ways. This could be on-site exhibits, this could be signage. Right now, it's a lot of virtual MBG, which means we're out there trying to connect with the public via our social medias, on our website. And so our education department is contributing to that as quickly as we are able. And so this was a great opportunity. This exhibit has been for some time. And unfortunately, despite our closure, we like to think quickly and figure out what we can do in the intermediary. I was already working on what we call a story map, which uses an ArcGIS function online to provide a map of this expedition. Use our communications colleagues. I was working with Cassidy Moody, who you will see a lot online right now, putting out a lot of great tours and content from the garden. So in doing that, we were designing that just to go alongside the that would physically be present at the house right now. But in that absence of physical space, I was able to transition this to be a bit more content heavy, share it with the public. So as I was imagining sharing it with the public, I was excited to have an opportunity to share it with volunteers as well. I'm definitely looking forward to sharing more of this content in preparation for what will be happening soon. Andrea, can you advance the slide for me?
Yes.
This is your friendly reminder for this experience. Again, we ask that you hit the mute button that you'll find on the lower left-hand side of your screen. It looks like a microphone when you click it, and it has a line through it. That's going to eliminate any background noise or anything you have going on in your home, so that way this recording is clear. We also ask that you use the chat box. That's a function that can be found at the bottom of your screen. You click it and it will pop up. This allows you to ask your questions, of which I will answer at the very end. These meetings get kind of hectic if everyone's talking at one time. So please use that chat, and I will continue to refer to it through the course of this presentation and more at the end to make sure all of your questions are answered. In that chat function, we remind you that this is an open learning-based environment. We encourage you to be positive and kind to one another in the chat, and know that this is being recorded. So if you do need to depart for any reason, we completely understand. We're really enjoying seeing all of your faces, but this will be recorded. I may have preemptively spoke for Andrea, but I think the recording link will be in the Vine newsletter.
Yes.
Here coming out tomorrow. So please look for that if you do have to depart or have other things you need to do. Andrea, do you want to advance now?
Yes.
Great, thank you. So I do want to add here, I wanted to start first with a little bit about interpretation. And I know that all of you volunteer in different capacities within the education department, but at some point in whatever role you're fulfilling, you are doing interpretation in that you are taking information and communicating it to the public in hopes that it builds connections with our audience. You may do it in the form of a formal class that you teach, or you might do it in the form of a docent tour that you're giving to strangers every once in a while, or it might be that you work directly within Tower Grove House, and again, you're interacting with the general public. So making sure that as we think about this content, we keep in mind that interpretation is really the key to making sure that our audiences are connecting with what we have to share with them, both this content and others, and that you're finding the best connection points for people to connect with whatever you want them to learn. We do that with a variety of audiences and age brackets, and you all have your specialties. But I did want to introduce that this concept of interpretation is very much what we are all doing and what makes us all important and valued members of the education department as a whole, because those connections are what are building lifelong experiences and encouraging, thank you, Andrea, the future connections that people will have with our spaces. So I don't know if you've seen these before, but these are some of the goals that we hope to find in both the interpretation department itself, but in education as a whole, in terms of forging those relationships between people and plants, inviting people to explore and take what they learn with you in an experience back out into their communities or across the globe, to really encourage that home-based experience that's becoming even more real as we are all at home now. I feel like while the virtual world can be a challenge, it's opened up a lot of opportunities for us to be able to foster that appreciation for nature and history through the content that we provide the public, and forcing them more or less to go do it in their own backyard. We love our garden space and are so grateful to have the botanical garden at our fingertips as a teaching tool normally, but we've been doing our best to transition that learning and those opportunities for connecting back to someone's own backyard or their community. So those experiences are going to continue to make a huge impact in the future when we're all able to return to our assigned duties. But I wanted to get you thinking about a new topic and how you might share it with the public. I do have a prompt or two at the end in hopes that we might have a virtual conversation that will allow us to kind of think through how we would share content like this or other content to keep those connections going with our audiences that are very much missing us. Andrea, can you advance for me? Again, I wanted to add this slide only because it is very relevant. This might be content that we're currently sharing within Tower Grove House, but this content very much applies to all of your volunteer roles. I know a lot of you cross-pollinate, as we like to say. You do docent tours or other education classes, adult classes, youth classes. Many of you serve as volunteers in the museum building or in Tower Grove House, celebrating our Victorian district for visitors. So I do hope that you keep this question in mind as you hear some of the content that I'm going to share. Again, when I share story documents or the other things ahead of time, I'm hoping that you are digesting it not just from an information standpoint, but you are thinking about how you can share that, because this is my favorite slide that I put in every presentation I make. You really are the Velcro that makes the information stick. You are, the left side is what people already know, and the right side is what you're providing to them, and you are what is in the middle, adhering those two things together. So everyone that comes to us, as you know, starts at a different place. So as I start to kind of walk through this, be thinking about how this information could apply to what role you serve as a volunteer, where or how you would like to share this. If you have great ideas, again, please put them in the chat box for us. So I can both record them and we can maybe talk a little bit about them once I'm done talking about the history part. Thank you, Andrea. So you should have seen in the email that you received the story document that is associated with this. Every time we have a new exhibit, I try to do a fair amount of research both to write the content that will go on the walls, but to equip all of our volunteers to be able to share this narrative with the public in a comfortable way. So those documents, while at times lengthy, hopefully are a good read over coffee or a glass of wine while you're at home, hopefully outside enjoying the sunshine today. And those are your basis for the factual part of what we are sharing. The interpretation part comes later as we think about the best ways to present this information and what is really going to engage the public in terms of the story that we're telling. So I wanted to start with saying a little bit about this exhibit. So this exhibit came from some conversations that I was having with Cassidy and some of our other members of the Library and Archives department there in Science and Conservation at the Garden, talking about people who Dr. Trelease consistently connected with, or people that he really got to know well. And through that, kind of talked about some of these lifelong friends that he had, especially people like the famed John Muir. A while ago, Cassidy had done a great blog post in Discover and Share, which I can add to the chat box here in a few minutes, about John Muir and the National Park Service and his connection to the garden. And through that, I started to learn more about the Harriman expedition and how John Muir and Dr. Trelease came to be acquainted. And through that, learned a ton more about the importance of science and this expedition and the benefits and outcomes of that. So I continued on that path and decided it would be the 2020 exhibit. So this content will appear in the second floor East Wing exhibit, where we talk about the Trelease family. And then there'll be a photo, oh, go back one, Andrea, thank you. There'll be a photo exhibit on the first floor that shares images from this experience. So you'll hear me talk a bit about the variety of those things. I have tried very hard to synopsize this within that document, but there's a lot of really interesting elements, just like any adventure out into the world, that make it difficult to really synopsize how important and how interesting this adventure was. So I wanted to start by talking about Dr. Trelease, because I don't know quite where everybody's context is for him. If you're familiar with him and who he is, beyond just being the first director of the garden after Henry Shaw passes. So Dr. Trelease is a very interesting character to begin with. Dr. Trelease is from Mount Vernon, New York, and his father was a pattern cutter in a metalworking skill field, which means that as tradition, you were usually learning the trade of your father. So it was his path from a young age to become a metal worker, but because of his personal interest, he grew up in the woods. He grew up hunting and fishing and hiking around upstate New York, and learned to appreciate nature just by being outside, which I think is a very connective narrative for a lot of our kids that we're entertaining at the garden. A lot of them don't necessarily see themselves in botanical careers, but just like Dr. Trelease, anybody can be a collector. He would be known to gather things and start his own collections just by the things that he enjoyed outside, and that's something we very much encourage through a lot of our programming. So that's a very connective story. He attended Cornell University in the 1870s. And at that time, being a botanist meant that you went through academia and then you became a teacher to be able to do more research, which is exactly what he did. He eventually would attend Harvard to be able to do more in-depth coursework. But in this instance, the most important part of his coursework is that As an intern, he worked as a special agent of the United States Department of Agriculture. And by getting involved in the system, this is how he would eventually come to know or be known by the people who were organizing this expedition. So this minor internship type apprenticeship in his early botanical studies at Cornell would eventually be what would draw him to this experience by meeting the right people. Again, networking can never be understated. So it is Harvard that brings him to know Henry Shaw as he studied under Asa Gray. Trelease was teaching in Wisconsin at the University of Madison when he met his wife and began a family, but was soon referred by his old professor Asa Gray to Henry Shaw, who was looking for someone to head the newly created Department of Botany at Washington University here in St. Louis. And after Henry Shaw got to know Dr. Trelease quite a bit, just like I make the Willy Wonka connection a lot. Dr. Trelease and Henry Shaw got to know each other, and Henry Shaw decided that Dr. Trelease would also become the first director of the garden. And then very quickly moved to St. Louis. So they lived downtown for a short time, and then after they transitioned, Henry Shaw passed, and then they transitioned to Tower Grove House. They would take up residence there, oversee the renovation of the East Wing, eventually raised 4 boys there, and lived there until 1912, when he would move to head the Department of Botany at the University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana, and live out the rest of his life there. We are very fortunate to be able to tell the story of Dr. Trelease in what I still consider our newly renovated East Wing of Tower Grove House. I'm going to keep saying that probably for the next 5 to 10 years, just to remember how much work that took for all of us to make happen. I'm very proud of that exhibit. So he would really make a huge impact on the research part of the garden, in that Henry Shaw, as we all know, was not a botanist. He knew the right people and had begun collecting and creating their own herbarium, but really wasn't going out and collecting in the same way that botanists do. So when Dr. Trelease joined the garden, he very quickly came to reorganize and formally assemble the herbarium that today is one of the largest in the world. And start using the resources that Henry Shaw was gathering to really establish the scientific wing of the garden. So in the course of his life, he would identify and name over 2,500 species of plants. I mean, the volume of work and organizational function that he did, both for our institution and the botanical field at large, cannot be understated. And this experience on this expedition really is a testament to his ability to really perform that scientific duty that we still very much participate in today as a world-leading institution. Is everyone still with me? I feel like I'm just talking in my kitchen to no one. Do I still have everybody? I see a few people in the chat. So if you could advance for me, Andrea. Thank you. So the next character that we bring in here is Edward Harriman. So Edward Harriman is also his own interesting character. I feel like I have to feature him only because this expedition is named for him. In that he grows up as a pastor's son in a rural area, and at the age of 14 ends up in New York City in the New York Stock Exchange, and works his way all the way up to become one of the heads of the Union Pacific Railroad, which at that time you couldn't find a way to print money faster than to work for the railroad. However, because of this background, which is quite humble and very American dream-esque, he has kind of a complex, and a lot of people see him as new money because of his background, and because of that, he feels really strongly about trying to find a way to prove to people that he is a part of the upper class, which at that time still included philanthropy. I did try to compare a bit in the document you might have read, his attitude being similar to Henry Shaw, in that at that time, the way that you proved you were wealthy was by being generous to other people. And that philanthropy often represented itself in the sciences. Your contributions to the world were very important to your social standing. And so after a variety of conversations, Harriman realized that it was very much possible for him to compile the leading scientists in the United States and go on a journey that would serve both to up his social standing, that would also fulfill his personal interest in going on vacation, in that he had friends encouraging him to go hunt the Kodiak bears of Alaska, but to also see what the possibilities of Alaska held. A lot of people only knew about Alaska from reading. There were not many images or other recordings of what was happening in Alaska at that time, other than that there was a lot of movement that direction by Westerners who had moved to California in the midst of the gold rush and had not really struck it big, who were looking for new lands and new ways to make money. And then through the economic markets, hearing about where salmon was coming from, or hearing where fur was coming from, and knowing that Alaska was this place of untapped potential monetarily. The newspapers, if you read any newspaper accounts of when this trip was being planned, talk most about this grand idea about building a railroad around the world. And to us in the 21st century, that sounds crazy. That sounds absolutely impossible. But at the end of the Industrial Revolution, so much had changed in the course of less than 100 years that truthfully nothing was impossible. Just like today, we think with technology, oh, in 20 years, I'm going to have a robot doing my dishes or taking care of all of my horses outside, God willing. Harriman and the rest of the public truly believed that you could do anything if you had the money and the foresight to do it. And so the papers really picked up on this idea that he was trying to scout ways to dig a tunnel under the Siberian Peninsula and build a tunnel from Alaska into Russia that would take the railroad around the world. And so because of all of these reasons, a group of people were compiled. There are many great profiles in that document that you received that share kind of this ragtag group of professionals who are at the pinnacle in their given field. Many of them have background or histories of other expeditions. There are quite a few that were on the committees for Yosemite or for the Grand Canyon or going up through Death Valley. You know, all of these Western territories that had been explored were these guys kind of became known as the explorers and scientists that were exploring the West. So compiling this group of people was very complicated, as I mentioned. Clinton Merriam, which is the Merriam in the dictionary, or connected anyway, he becomes the man, so to speak, that is gathering all these scientists together on Harriman's behalf. And so he's using his connections to find people. And because Merriman is connected to the United States government, he comes to know Dr. Trelease. He sends him a letter, just a letter in the mail that says, hey, I have this guy who wants to do this scientific, philanthropic exploration of Alaska in July. Do you want to go? In a very base way. And Trelease says, yes, I want to go. And so as they cross the country, scientists continue to get on the Union Pacific Railroad, and then they depart from Seattle in 1899. Can you flip the page for me, Andrea?
Yes.
They board SS George W. Elder. The picture of this ship is on your screen here. This vessel is very interesting. It is a steamship that is known for hauling cargo. It's essentially a cargo ship that had been taking things up and down the coast, primarily the western coast from California down to Mexico and beyond. And Harriman purchases this ship and retrofits it to fit his needs. So for all accounts and all intents and purposes, every recording of this ship talks about how lovely it is, how comfortable and wonderful the trip itself is. There's a chef on board. He retrofits the hull that would normally have storage on it to be a storage container for specimens. There are areas that are transitioned to like libraries to have resources and places to mount specimens. So they were actively doing the specimen mounting on this boat as they gathered things. Again, I mentioned that this is a family vacation. So Harriman brings his wife and at least 3 of his children on this adventure. And so there's children there, young children. There's a chaplain and all of the employees it takes to run a ship like this, beyond all of these scientists who are all there for very different reasons. It's any assortment of hard sciences, botany, biology, people looking for animal specimens, insects, a lot of geology. They're looking for mining and rock specimens, you know, and anything you can imagine, in addition to the arts. So recording the writing about this image and what they're seeing, and describing the ethnographic culture that they're encountering. So everyone is packed on this ship, and the way that they characterize the experience of the boat seems quite lovely. I even read in one resource that this is one of the first places that the Edison bulb is used outside of land. So that it was even electrified. It was very comfortable. And so the ship obviously is rather large. They would go from port to port, or if they weren't able to dock, they would throw the anchor out and take smaller boats to get to land to gather the specimens that they were looking for. The man that you're seeing on this screen here is the captain, Peter Dorian. He is a quite well-known captain of ships of that type at that time. Because of this expedition, he would even have a mountain named for him in Alaska, as they discovered, I'll use that in quotations, new lands as they went along. But beyond that, the scientists lived a very comfortable life on this boat. They traveled about 9,000 miles, about 2 months of travel in the summer, and would return with about 100 trunks of specimens that would be stored within this boat. And beyond that, about 5,000 photographs or botanical sketches that would really give people the imagery of what this adventure looked like. And I do enjoy mentioning these connections because as you see, that ship is large, but it's not that big, which means that this group of characters was aboard this ship together for 2 months, going on adventures, discovering, gathering, looking at new lands that a lot of people had never seen before. So some of these group photos show just a ragtag group, but as I mentioned, a lot of them would go on smaller expeditions depending on what they were looking to gather. So this is a great picture on the left of John Muir and John Burroughs, both of whom were considered kind of the naturalist, artistic, so to speak, voices on this endeavor, in that they both were explorers or had done other Western exploration, but they were also writers. and were recording what they encountered or saw along the way. John Burroughs becomes extremely important to this experience in that his diary becomes what is used to justify other long-term preservation needs in Alaska, because he was able to very distinctly write down both the value and importance of the land and what was being done to it that was negatively impacting it. So these observations were just as valuable as the specimens that they were gathering. Thank you, John, in the chat for clarifying. He asked what sort of ship was the George Elder. Yes, it was a steamship, which meant that there was a crew of people that had to feed it to encourage it to carry on. So yes, thank you for clarifying that. Don't hesitate to put other questions in the chat, as I'm happy to answer those here as we carry on. Andrea, do you want to flip the page for me? In the course of learning more about this adventure, I identified 3 outcomes that are of value to share in terms of what was taken away from this experience. I tried to imagine Dr. Trelease's outcomes being different, maybe, than what I'm seeing as a historian of the future, so to speak. But the first thing that changed quite dramatically from this engagement was the economic outcomes. And that prior to this, there had been a huge influx of what I would call European or white settlement of Alaska that was related to their gold rush, they call the Kodiak gold rush. That's some years after the California gold rush. And this is encouraged that these people, both looking for gold, also alerted big business that there were a lot of untapped resources that Alaska could offer. This is seen in the fishing industry, that at this time is being engorged by overfishing to the point that there were almost no more salmon left. The fur industry, the West had pretty much decimated their fur resources, and so as they travel up to Alaska, they identified bear, other small mammals that could continue the fur market, along with other seafood and mining opportunities. There were beyond gold, other gems as well as hard rock that could be used in the rest of the continental United States. So all of those industries were really operating unchecked before people like John Burroughs wrote about what he was seeing. They were passing fishing stations that were obviously using just the fillet part of a fish and discarding the rest, overfishing in volumes, and recording how the land was being used and what kind of detriment that was having, both to the native people who lived there and to the land from a environmental perspective. So in that way, a lot of what they brought back from that experience helped inform the legislation and congressional acts that will eventually come to preserve some of those areas and put some checks and balances on the economic uses of those resources. And then talking more about what the cultural impacts are. At the turn of the 1900s, unfortunately, Native people were still not well regarded in terms of their value to the United States and the value of their culture to the area that they had traditionally lived in. And so this is the first opportunity that Americans, I will say, of the rest of the continent, were really seeing what the Eskimo and Northern Ute populations were really experiencing in real time. They were about 5 years into a heavy white settlement and were suffering dramatically from an influx of white colonialism. People were building in their traditional homelands, taking their resources and using those people as employees or workers, and damaging their environment along the way. So the photo exhibit that will go into Tower Grove House on the first floor comes from the famed photographer Edward Curtis. He's well known for photographing Native people across the United States. However, the Harriman expedition was his first foray into portrait photography of Native tribes. He previously had just done studio portrait photographs and was making money that way, but got picked up by someone on the journey to Alaska and fell in love with this type of photography and would eventually become famous for it. So this photo exhibit shows both the landscape and the lands that they were seeing, but it also really shows what the Native people were doing, what their life was like, and how they were not benefiting from their circumstances. And the third bullet, and the one that most applies to the garden, is the scientific element. Again, specimen upon specimen, hundreds and hundreds of specimens came back, many to our botanical garden. There are hundreds that are represented in Tropicos. I can drop that link into the chat here at the end of the presentation if you want to flip through those at your leisure. But the scientific impacts were hard to explain overall. I mean, took over 50 specialists about 10 years to cull all of the specimens and to catalog all of the things that they brought back from this expedition. The goal in the long term that Dr. Merriman had was to create what I would consider like an encyclopedia of this experience. So in the course of that 10 years, all of the participants contributed to an 11-volume work that discussed all of these different specimens and the science that they impacted. I speak a lot, or we acknowledge quite a bit in the exhibit right now, the importance of this being a marker. And the things that they recorded from this experience are still used today as kind of a marker for what untouched Alaska looks like. And they're able to do a lot of global and climate change study, even with this information from 100 years ago. So this has had long-lasting effects in terms of climate change, and helping people see how environments are changing over time. Thank you, Andrea. So I did note on this slide that you will see this manifested in a photo exhibit on the first floor of Tower Grove House. And then there'll be some signage changes on the second floor. I do have a few objects that I am gathering from Science and Conservation that relate to this, including one of the publications that Dr. Trelease would have contributed to that I was just speaking about. So his chapter, so to speak, we have a copy of that I'm hoping to put on display, as well as copies of the specimens that were gathered. Dr. Trelease on this experience gathered a lot of mosses and other bryophytes, which is really interesting. Very, very tiny things, but very cool things. Moss is weird and very cool. If you don't know a lot about it, I would encourage you to look through that Tropicos listing, of all the things that he gathered. But there are some other things happening at Tower Grove House I wanted to talk. I wanted to share too some of the other things that are going on. When we return, we will be returning to freshly painted walls in the east wing. On the first floor, we did some of those maintenance updates before things closed. There'll be some different signage in the kitchen. We're also working on a touch box project. I have David, one of our team members, to thank for his hard work on that. We're trying to include or introduce some touchable elements in every room. So look for more information or content about that and how you might be able to incorporate those into a tour or another experience that you're bringing through the house. We still will surely be doing story time and daily programming. When times return, it might be a little bit altered in terms of what is touchable and what is safe for each person to be able to engage with, but those things are still on the docket. And we are working tirelessly as a team to write more artifact profiles. So this has given us a lot of opportunity to do research on objects that are in the house. And so you will be getting probably a lot more of that content than usual because we've had some uninterrupted time as a team to work on that. And I'm excited to share some of those things with you as well. Andrea, do you want to advance one more slide? Because this is the opportunity to ask questions. Again, if you throw them into the chat box, I'm happy to address more direct things, but I also would like to know, based on some of what I've shared, what you think the visitor will most connect with, what will be the most appealing part of this narrative, or what you think has the most potential to connect to whatever audience you're connecting with. I would love to know more about that, or what you think might be the most effective to talk most about. So that's a good question. Thank you, Kyle. Kyle asks, are any of the herbarium specimens going to be on display in the house? That's a great question. Unfortunately, because of the boundaries of a historic home, even dried plants, for the most part, are not permitted within the house. We're very cautious about what kind of plant material is brought into the house. And so we are very thoughtful when we do that. And often, because of the volume of people who handle or want to see closer what we're doing, we make copies that are high resolution and high quality. So that way they're very much touchable, tangible, and something people can really inspect, so to speak. But I will put in a plug here. The story map that we made, that you have access to here, let me throw it into the chat box, because this story map, one of the tabs is about plants and where those plants are gathered from. So it takes a map and it throws pings on a map. There's one for people that has some of those historic photos I was talking about. There's one about places that kind of talks about what each place would have been like that they stopped at, but then it has those herbarium samples uploaded and where they were gathered from. So that's very much a cool place to do that. Yes, this is very great. Thank you. Christy says, I think that the part that will jump out the most to people depends on where they're coming from. Yes, the art of interpretation. Since I was coming from the zoo most recently, the impact on climate, species, and the people is of great interest. Yes, a lot of people, I think, will connect to the concept overall, even if they don't necessarily connect to the plant part of it, because they did gather a lot more than just plants. Lots of pictures, lots of sketches, ornithology, large mammals. You know, they collected everything that they could. Unfortunately, also even ethnographic materials. So they did find no longer inhabited native residences and gathered some of those materials, like these amazing, beautiful giant totem poles that were hand carved. In today's world, we definitely would not take those, but at that time, the expectations for gathering was different. Yes, John from the school programs team shares the national importance of the expedition, or in terms of establishing Alaska as a state. The territory was bought from Russia, 30 years prior? Yes. Yes, John, you are correct in that this is just in the infancy of Alaska statehood. And while there are benefits to being a part of the United States, that also comes with some challenges. And once people know it's a place to go or a destination, the demographic of the area changes very quickly. It also impacts the way that industry interacts with it as well, and opens up the floodgate for businesses to try to find ways to make money on the natural resources. So this very much had an impact, but at the same time also was able to prevent some of this and offer some preservation. If it had still been a territory, the government would have not had as much ability to impact the way that it was protected, following some of the feedback that they got from that. There is not a QR code yet, Kyle, because I don't know. I am not a tech expert on that front, but hopefully I will be able to generate one soon. This just went out via the social since we've been in our new work situation. So I'm hoping to get a QR code that will be able to put within the exhibit when we are able to return and reopen to the public. Yes, I love all of these comments. Thank you, Joe. This exhibit is evidence of discovery in earlier times and the value of scientists working together. Absolutely. Yes, and talking about the dinner discussions, what's very cool, they talk a lot about how every night one of the scientists was assigned to give a presentation after dinner to talk about either what they're an expert in or what they were discovering, or talk through. It sounds like it might have been a lot of blowharding at times, but I'm sure it was also very valuable scientific banter that allowed them to kind of think through what they were doing. And yes, Morgan, thank you for this good plug. We're also working on a guide by cell experience for a virtual tower grow house, which means that we will have a digital platform to go room by room, linked to a lot of those artifact profiles that you all love and enjoy as your own content. And this will be linked to that. So the more virtual content that we're able to generate right now, it feels very different for us, but it's also a great opportunity to enhance our online presence and really offer more of that to people around the world who don't always have a chance to come and enjoy the garden. So yes, there will be links to expedition stuff related to this in our Guide by Cell experience that will be rolling out hopefully within the next couple weeks. So stay tuned for more about that also. Thank you for that reminder, Morgan. Do I have other questions, thoughts, ideas? No? Okay. Well, this was really fun. It's very strange to just be talking to a screen. I wish I could see all of you in person, but this is going to have to do for now. I'm so thankful that you came and learned a little bit more about this. I hope this was interesting and you have a few more resources if you want to continue to read or learn more about some of the different things. This was just the tip of the iceberg. If you want to keep reading about this topic, I'm also happy to provide more resources beyond what's already in. At the end of that story document, there should be a list of resources. If you do want to learn more, read more about this, it's a very interesting experience and it's very much at the end of its time in terms of grand expeditions into the wild unknown. This was kind of it. So it's a very interesting experience. And I'm so thankful that I got to see all of your faces. If you have questions or want to connect directly, don't hesitate to email me. I'm happy to chat anytime, okay?